So if we look at this in an image, I found a good image of this online because it's kind of hard to think about it by looking at some of the images in your book. So this is the bladder, right? And so the urethra that comes out of the bladder immediately starts going through the prostate, right? So the prostatic urethra is the first part. And then as the vas deferens or the ductus deferens comes up into the body cavity, remember that it goes by the seminal vesicle. So the seminal vesicle contributes most of the fluid to the semen. And so that is the ejaculatory duct. So you can see the ejaculatory duct combines with the prostatic urethra in that part that is going right through the prostate gland. And so here you can really see what would happen if the prostate gland becomes enlarged and how it could easily cause problems specifically with urination. And then it also sometimes causes erectile dysfunction. So it has that can affect the blood flow to the erectile tissue in the penis as well. Okay, so that's the prostatic urethra. Okay, then we have what is called the membranous urethra. And so this is going through the body wall. And so this is going through the perineum. So this is traveling through the muscle. So this is traveling through the perineum, which is skeletal muscle. And then we have the urethra going out into the penis. And so this is what is referred to as the spongy urethra. So this is the penis. And the reason why it's called the spongy urethra is that we have what is called spongy tissue in the urethra, or no, in the penis. And so the spongy tissue in the penis is called erectile tissue, because it can fill with blood and cause the tissue to become stiff, right? So this is the erectile tissue. Now, when we look at the erectile tissue, we can see that there's two different types of erectile tissue. We have what is called the corpora, and there's two of them, cavernosa. Right, so there's two corpora cavernosa, and then there is one corpus, so that's singular, spongiosum. Okay, so that's the erectile tissue that is around the urethra. Okay. So if we look at the male anatomy, right, you need to be able to identify, right? This is my ejaculatory duct right here. This is my ureter coming down. This is my ductus deferens coming up. This would be my prostatic urethra. This is the membranous urethra as it goes through the body wall. And then this would be the spongy urethra, okay? And then if you look at a cross section, you can see the different erectile tissues which have blood vessels associated with them. So if you look at the two, those are the cavernosa. And I kind of remember them because if you look at it in this structure, there's like connective tissue that makes these little cavernous structures here, right? And then the spongiosum, I remember, oh, the spongy urethra. So I remember the corpus spongiosum is what the urethra goes through, and there's only one of them. So this would be dorsal, right? And then this would be ventral. Okay. Okay, so if we look at the response, the male sexual response, one of the interesting things about the sexual response is that it is the autonomic nervous system. So what this means is that it can be unconscious, right? So you can get a male erection, for example, without consciously being aware of it or actually causing it, right? It's conscious causing it. And so we have then the parasympathetic nervous system is what leads to erection. So this one causes the erection. And it's due to the release of nitric oxide gas. So this is NO. And what NO does is it causes vasodilation of the blood vessels that are leading to the erectile tissue. Okay. So when we think about what is called erectile dysfunction, right, this is the inability to achieve an erection, which could have psychological reasons, but it could also have physiological reasons. And so the common drug, which is called Viagra, right, actually increases nitrous oxide concentrations. So that is how it works. It actually increases the release of nitric oxide by the neurons. So this is actually a neurotransmitter that's released by the nervous system, and then that causes the blood vessels to dilate, and that causes the erection to occur. Okay, so that's the first part of the sexual response. And then it's the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight, which actually causes the ejaculation. So this is one of, I think I mentioned this when we were talking about the autonomic nervous systems. This is one of those weird, like the only thing in our bodies that has to have the two divisions working together. And they have to occur, you know, parasympathetic has to occur first, and then the sympathetic has to take over and it causes ejaculation. So it's kind of a complex thing that has to occur in order for the full male sexual response to occur. Okay. So let's talk about the control of male reproduction, which is obviously less complex than that of female. Because they're not having to regulate the and coordinate the release of the egg and the preparation of the uterus for implantation. So, but these are the names of the hormones that are involved are actually were actually named in females first, and they said, oh, these are the same hormones in males. So the names don't make sense really in terms of male physiology because they were named for the female first. Okay, so we have in our hypothalamus, we have a hormone that's produced, which is called the gonadotropin, otropin releasing hormone. So this is a hormone that releases or causes the release of other hormones. So this has an easy way to abbreviate it. It is GnRH, right? Gonadotropin releasing hormone. So remember that the testes and the ovaries are also called gonads, okay? So this travels to the anterior pituitary gland. So via the circulatory system, it goes to the anterior pituitary gland, and then it causes the release of two other hormones. And these hormones are called follicle stimulating hormone. So the follicles are in the females, but it's the same hormone that's found in males. And this is called the luteinizing hormone. So you can abbreviate this as FSH and LH. So these are hormones that are released into the circulatory system. And so they travel all over, but they bind to receptors on the testes. So these go to the testes. And this one specifically binds to receptors on cells which are called the sustentacular. Make sure I spell that right. I had it all written down, sorry. Oh, can't find it. I think it's this. We'll look at it in a minute. Okay, so sustenance, like to sustain, right? So these are the cells. These are large cells. And they actually are so large that they actually form the entire lining of the seminiferous tubule. So from the very edge of the seminiferous tubule to the lumen of the seminiferous tubule where the sperm are produced. And so we would say that the sperm production occurs inside these cells. So it's really weird, but sperm production occurs inside those large cells, sustentacular cells. Okay, so the sustentacular cells produce androgen binding protein. So this is abbreviated as ABP, androgen binding protein. So what this does is that this increases testosterone levels within the sustentacular cell. So testosterone starts to accumulate in there, and then this leads to the production of sperm. So this leads to spermatogenesis. Maybe I'll put leads to. Okay, so it leads to sperm being produced. Okay, so let's look at a diagram. They'll tell me if I spelled my word right. I did, oh good. Okay, so this is the seminiferous tubule. This is the entire lining of the seminiferous tubule. This is one sustentacular cell right here, right? So it's weird, it's just this large cell. And then notice how there's actually cells within that, right? And so that's the FSH coming down and binding to the sustentacular cell. Then ABP produces or causes testosterone to be activated, and then spermatogenesis takes place. Okay. So let's look at what happens with LH. So LH is released, and it is doesn't actually go into the seminiferous tubules. It goes into cells that are outside the seminiferous tubules, which are called interstitial cells. So LH, okay, binds to interstitial cells. Interstitial. So think outside. Like we talk about interstitial fluid, right, which is outside the cell. So these are outside the seminiferous tubule. And these produce testosterone. So we could say that the testes is also an endocrine gland because testosterone is a hormone. It's a steroid hormone that has all kinds of effects on the body, right, from enlarged genitalia to hair growth, to big muscles, right, to bigger bodies, right, more muscular, more bone mass. And so that's testosterone. Okay, so this is all regulated in a feedback mechanism because we want the testosterone to remain relatively constant, right, unless they found that things like competitive activities can boost your testosterone levels. So like if you're in competition, you can have a testosterone boost, right? And they've actually also found that testosterone actually fluctuates a little bit within 20 minutes. And so males, they have a testosterone release and then it goes down. And so they have cycles, but they're only 20 minutes in length, right? Whereas ours is a monthly cycle, but theirs is 20 minutes, right? Okay, so it's a lot different than in the females. So if we look at this, the sustentacular cells produce a hormone called inhibin. And inhibin shuts down the production of FSH. And then the testosterone itself is also a negative feedback on LH. So if we go back to our diagram, we would say that, and I ran out of room here, but I might put it down here. I would say inhibin shuts down FSH production, or release, we'll put release. Because we want the sperm to be produced at a high rate, but not too high of a rate, right? And then the same thing here, the testosterone, right? High testosterones decrease LH. So there's a negative feedback here. So as you increase testosterone, right, we would decrease the production of LH, right? And that helps with homeostasis of testosterone. We don't want testosterone to go like way off the roof, right? Or be so low that normal spermatogenesis cannot occur, right? So homeostatic mechanism, negative feedback mechanism. Does everybody understand that idea? Okay, so if we look at the semen, it actually consists, if we look at the ejaculate, so what the male ejaculates, it is about 2 to 5 mils of fluid, and it contains 50 to 130 million sperm per milliliter. So about 50 to 130 million sperm per milliliter. Okay. So that is how that number is regulated through the negative feedback mechanism of FSH and inhibin. So sometimes we get infertility occurring because the male isn't producing enough sperm. I think the cutoff is like 15 million sperm per milliliter is generally a cutoff for infertility. So they can actually kind of estimate how many sperm are in a given ejaculate. So it's got to be a lot for the male to be fertile. Okay. Okay. So if we look at testosterone, one of the interesting things is that testosterone actually is relatively high prenatally. So if you notice here in the fetus at between 3 and 6 months, we have this peak, and it's like 2/3 of what is found in the adult. And so this is really important. So we're going to talk about testosterone, but in the fetus, the testosterone leads to the development of genitalia, the male genitalia. Right. So sometimes babies are born with ambiguous genitalia where you can't tell whether they're male or female. And it could be due to having too much testosterone if you're a female, or having not enough testosterone if you're male, right? So that testosterone level is really important in determining that external and internal as well, the genitalia. And then you'll notice that at puberty, it rises, right? And we get what is called the secondary sex characteristics. Secondary sexual characteristics developing, right? So we get hair body hair, like pubic hair, armpit hair, right? We also get facial hair, and then we get an increase in bone and muscle mass. So testosterone is anabolic. It tends to produce tissues. So it's an anabolic steroid. Okay. Okay, so let's move to the female reproductive structures. We'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the development of the reproductive structures. So the gonad in the female are obviously the ovaries. And in the female, it's really interesting because unlike the testes, the ovaries are not directly connected to a duct. They're supported and they're maintained by ligaments. So ligaments hold the ovaries in place, but they don't have a duct directly connecting to them. So if I show you a picture here, this is the duct, but it has just finger-like extensions that, and there's a current of fluid, so that hopefully anything that's released by the ovary, let's see if I get a better picture, anything that's released by the ovary will be drawn into the duct. And then here you can see how the ovaries are kind of held in place by mesenteries and also by ligaments that hold them in place. So even though it's not connected to the duct, it's held in place, okay? And the ovaries obviously are up in the body cavity, so body temperature, core body temperature does not affect oogenesis as it does spermatogenesis. Okay. So I will say that they are not directly connected to ducts. Okay, and so the oviduct, which is the same thing as the fallopian tubes or the uterine tube, so this is also uterine tube, right? They capture the egg after it is ovulated. So the egg is released, and then initially it's actually in the body cavity. So it's actually in the peritoneal body cavity, and then it has to be sucked into the uterine tube. And we'll talk about this, but this is a problem because sometimes you can get bacteria or maybe even epithelial cells getting into the body cavity and then causing things like endometriosis and also body cavity infections, okay? Or even ectopic pregnancies in the body cavity. Okay, so these capture the egg after ovulation. This is also where fertilization must take place. So that means that the sperm has to travel all the way up from the vagina, all the way up through the cervix into the uterus and then into the oviduct in order for fertilization to take place. And the reason is that the egg only has so many nutrients, and when it needs to get fertilized and then start dividing so that by the time it gets to the uterus, it can actually implant in the uterus and start to use the nutrients provided by the uterine wall, okay? The next is the uterus, and this is sometimes referred to as the womb. This is where implantation takes place. So this is implantation of the embryo. Now, if the embryo implants in the uterine tube instead, that is called a tubal pregnancy. So a tubal pregnancy is really bad and generally has to be surgically dealt with so that the uterine tubes do not rupture. The tubal pregnancy is where the embryo implants in the oviduct. Okay. Now, when we look at the uterus, we can also see that the uterus is made of smooth muscle. So this is important because the smooth muscle contractions that are going to lead to the baby being pushed out of the uterus and into the birth canal. And the smooth muscle layer is called the myometrium. So think myomuscle. Metrium is layer. Okay. There's also epithelial tissue in the uterus. And this is called the endometrium. So epithelial tissue, remember, lines organs, it lines the uterus. And the endometrium is pretty important because it becomes thick during the period of time when the female is getting ready to become pregnant, and then it sloughs off during menstruation. So we have two layers of the endometrium. We have the basal layer, and these contains cells that undergo mitosis. And this basal layer is always preserved, obviously, right? And then we have the functional layer, right? So this is the functional layer is the thickening and subsequent shedding during menstruation. So if a pregnancy does not occur, the female will menstruate and she will shed that functional layer. So it's kind of interesting because the blood vessels that supply energy and food and oxygen to the functional layer just constrict, and the functional layer dies, essentially. So it just kills those cells and they are sloughed off. Okay. So from the uterus, there is a barrier between the uterus and the vagina, which is referred to as the cervix. So the cervix is the barrier between, oops, not cervix. Cervix is the barrier between the uterus and the vagina. So when we talk about, we'll talk about the different stages of labor, but obviously the cervix has to dilate, right? And that is a thinning of the membrane and a widening of the membrane, which is going to eventually allow the baby to leave, right? But the cervix is also a barrier to sperm. So if a female is not ovulating, then no sperm can actually get through the cervix, right? And we'll talk more about that when we get to fertilization, how that occurs, okay? So in our diagram, this right here is the uterus. This is the myometrium, the thick, muscular, smooth muscle layer, and then the inner layer is the endometrium. And we'll look at those in lab. Remember, we do not have lab Friday because of Veterans Day, so it'll be next Friday. This right here is the cervix, right? And then the last part is the vagina. So we could say that the vagina receives, right, the penis during copulation. Okay. So if you look at the vagina, remember that the vagina is completely separate from the urethra. So there's an opening here, which would allow the female to urinate. and then there's the opening to the vagina. So there's separate openings to the excretory system and the urinary, or the urinary and the reproductive systems. Okay. So if we look at the external anatomy, okay, so the female has erectile tissue. So in the female, the erectile tissue is in the clitoris and in what is referred to as the bulb of the vestibule, or the vestibule bulbs. We'll put bulb of vestibule. Okay. So notice how this is similar to the male because it would surround the urethra. So the gray parts are the bulb of the vestibule. So when females have their sexual response, just like males, the parasympathetic nervous system causes erection. So blood would flow into the clitoris and make it bigger and rigid. And then it also flows into these little bulbs that come around the urethra. And so sometimes this can make it very difficult for females to urinate when they are sexually aroused. So it closes off the external urethral orifice. Okay. And then we also have another gland, which is called the greater vestibular gland. And this is homologous, or has the same origin and function as the bulbal urethral gland. So this would be, we'll put right. So remember, the bulbal urethral gland produces pre-seminal fluids. The greater vestibular gland produces a lubricating fluid. So this would lubricate the vagina prior to sexual intercourse, or maybe during sexual intercourse as well. But that would be the greater vestibular gland sits right down there, and that provides lubrication. So you can see the opening to the vestibular glands. Okay. Okay. So if we look at the female sexual response, it's the same as males in terms of the nervous system. Right? So the parasympathetic causes erection of the erectile tissue, blood flows in and that tissue becomes erect. And then it's the sympathetic nervous system that causes not ejaculation, but this in the case, but orgasm. So we have orgasm, and the orgasm is contraction in females, contraction of the vagina and uterus. And some people believe that, and they've actually done studies to kind of show this. In Europe, they did studies to show this. This is not in the United States, we're going to do that here. Okay, they actually show that orgasm actually helps move the sperm up into the reproductive tract, so it actually increases the likelihood of fertilization. So like if you were trying to get pregnant, if you're a couple, it's actually better for the female to have an orgasm after the male, because that actually can help move the sperm up. So it helps move the sperm up into the reproductive tract. Right. So it increases retention of sperm, the orgasm does. So if it happens after the male, then that would be beneficial if you're trying to get pregnant. Okay. Okay. So let's look at the development of the sex differences in males and females, and we can talk about homologous structures. So homologous structures in this case have the same embryonic origin. So it's the same set of tissues, same set of cells. So when we look at the gonads, they are same. So I'm just going to put the female here and the male here. Okay. So the female's ovaries come from the same tissues as the male's testes. So it's actually the presence of a Y chromosome and a specific gene on the Y chromosome that causes testosterone to be produced, and then the testes develop. If there's no Y chromosome and no functional gene, then by default, the embryo will become female. Okay, so we have the testes and the ovaries. Now the ducts are not homologous. So when we look at the oviduct and the ductus deferens, they are two separate tissues. And so if we look at a diagram of this, this is my early embryonic development. So this is like at 5 and 6 weeks. So you notice that the kidney looks really weird here. It is in red. Our kidney goes through like 3 different stages of being built and constructed. This is actually more like if you were to look at a frog or a fish kidney, this is what they look like in their bodies, okay? So this is the kidney, and notice how there's 2 sets of ducts, and then there's this gonadal ridge. So interestingly, the duct that is closest to the kidney is going to become the male ductus deferens, and the one that is farthest away is going to be the female oviduct. And so notice how this is already kind of open, right? And then this one is right attached, right? So that as they develop, one has to go away. So for example, in the female, the inner one, which is called, you don't need to know this, it's called the mesonephric duct. This one disappears, and then you're left with the female. In the other one, the female duct disappears, and you're left with the male, right? And so it's kind of interesting. They are not homologous. So the ducts are not homologous. Okay. Oops. Oh. Let's just go back to here. Okay. So we'll ignore that. Okay, so we can also look at the structures that are similar in the external genitalia. So we can say that, for example, in the females, we have the labia minora. And in the males, this fuses to form the shaft of the penis. And it's really interesting because in the adult male, you can see the seam, right? You can see where the tissues fuse, right? So that becomes the shaft of the penis. The labia minora are the innermost labia in the female. Then we have the labia majora, and this becomes the scrotal sac in the male. And again, you can see where those tissues fuse in the male, right? And then we have the clitoris. Okay. And in the male, we have what is called the glans penis. So that is the tip of the penis. And both of these are highly sensitive, right? So the clitoris is has lots of sensory receptors on it. It's really important for the sexual response. Same is important as the head of the penis. Now, both of these are actually covered by a prepuce. So we have a prepuce in both. So this is what is referred to as the foreskin in males. Okay, that's the foreskin. In the females, it covers the clitoris. And so if we go back to our diagram of the female, right? So this is my, oh, they don't have that one on there. Oh, I don't have one with a picture of it. But there would be a prepuce that would cover the clitoris. Okay. So it's really important to realize the difference between male circumcision and then what they do to females in some countries. Okay. So male circumcision is the removal of the foreskin. Okay. Female, they used to call it circumcision, right? but it's not. It's actually called female genital. Now, I mean, it's better to call it female genital mutilation, right? So they used to call it female circumcision to make, I think, make it sound a little bit better. But in female circumcision, quote unquote, this is actually the removal of the clitoris. And sometimes also what they do is they sew the labia minora together. And the result of this process actually makes copulation very painful, right? So copulation is painful and it's more difficult, right? And obviously not as pleasurable as if the clitoris was present, right? So in some African countries, they do this, and it has become kind of a big deal because as ethnic groups migrate to the United States, sometimes they bring their culture with them, right? And so in some parts of the country, they might see children, female children that are brought in to a doctor's office, and they might see that this has happened to them, that they've had some female genital mutilation. And so it's against the law to do this in our country, right? So they can't do it legally, but generally they do it anyway, right? And so it's very interesting from a cultural perspective because it is done by the females in the culture to other females. And the belief is that it ensures that the daughters will have a mate, so they'll be able to marry, right? So if they've had this done, then they're probably not going to be promiscuous. They're probably not going to want to have sex with all, other males, and so they make a better marriage to men in the culture. And so even though it's done by females, it's believed to be a way to control the sexuality of the females in the population, right? And so it's a huge issue. And it's kind of interesting. A few years ago, there was a female that actually came from South Africa and sought political asylum because she was so afraid that this was going to happen to her. And so the question is whether or not we should let people come and migrate to the United States to protect them from this cultural thing that happens in their country is something that we need to kind of decide on instead of leaving it in limbo.
Do they do it later or not at birth?
No, they do it later, and so it could be 5, 6, 7. And so in Africa, girls die, right? And so they get infections and then they die of it. And so it can also, it's problems, big,
They
huge
made like
issue.
a movie of that.
Yes.
It was like about a model that came from Africa, and then she became a model here, and she told her life story about it.
Right. There's also a really good book called Temple of My Familiar, I think it was, by the same person that wrote The Color Purple. Okay, so let's just stop there for today, and then we're going to move on to female reproductive cycles and hormones. So you might want to take a look at that before coming to class. It might make it easier to study. No lab on Friday, yay.